should be live, and I'm just going to take a second and wait for the stream to catch up with me. Hello, friends! Welcome to the first ever live stream I've done on Rasa. I'm just going to quickly mention that I'm live on Twitter. All right. Audio sounds good. Good morning, David. And hopefully it is connecting just fine. Oh, I'm getting some buffering. Okay, let me know if you guys are having any trouble with this. I am using a new setup. I know you can't tell from your end if you've been watching my live streams for a while, but on my end things look extremely different. I got different monitors in different places, so I'll probably be looking in some different directions. I don't have that many monitors. Welcome. So, if you have not watched any live streaming before, the general premise is that I'm going to work on a project, and I am starting this project completely from scratch. Today we're probably going to do more on the design and scoping side of things, and then we might get to coding today. We'll see. We will continue to work until it's done. Who knows how long that will take. Good morning to everyone. Jonathan says it looks good. Fantastic. Sounds good for David and Rohit and Greg. Awesome. Delighted to hear that. So, what are we going to be building? I have ambitiously called this project Dialect Bot. I might have to call it Dialects in the United States Bot to be a little bit more specific. You may have run into, a couple of years ago, the New York Times had this 2013, Jiminy Cricket, 7 years ago, time continues to pass, I guess. The New York Times had this quiz, and you answered a bunch of questions, and then it showed you where in the United States it thought you were from. Let's see if we can take the quiz. Yeah. So it had 25 questions. So how would you address a group of two or more people? I'd say y'all. I'm a y'aller. And oh, look, people who say y'all tend to be from the South. No surprise there, if you are, again, familiar with the dialects of the United States. What do you call a large wild cat native to the Americas? Some of these are different cats to me. I guess cougar. So this is the... Oh, interesting. That seems to be a Washington State sort of thing, which is where I live now. But I'm from the South. I'm from Virginia. So there are 25 questions, and you answer them, and then when you're done answering all of them, it shows you a map, and it's like, here's where we think in the United States you are from based on your answers to all of these questions. And if you haven't done it before, it's a lot of fun, even if you're not from the United States, because you can sort of see where you've picked up words from. Assuming you're an English speaker, which if you're watching this, I hope you are, because I don't know how good the automatic captions in languages other than English are. And the quiz itself is based on Bert Vo and Scott Golder's Harvard Dialect Survey, which was itself based on several earlier dialect surveys, the Dictionary of American Regional English, and whatever the one out of North Carolina is. I always forget the name of that. I think it starts with a P. The point being that there's this rich academic tradition of asking people questions about how they say specific words and learning about specific dialect features for different regions. And this quiz takes that information, asks you some questions, and gives you information about where your language use, where in the United States your language use is most similar to. I'm gonna have some coffee. And I think that this would be a fantastic thing to build a conversational assistant around. So one reason is that this sort of multiple choice format is actually not a great way to elicit sociolinguistic data. So what I mean by that, some background on me. One sec. First, some coffee. Then some background on me. My PhD is in linguistics and natural language processing, but I focused on computational sociolinguistics. So things like this, variation in language, and how we can build technology that can, accommodate that better. Just Another Lurker says, sorry to be a party pooper, but how long are you planning to stream today? Joining from another time zone in an odd time. That's a great question. Probably around an hour, unless I really get going. Albert says, Rasa camera looking clearer than the Kaggle one. Yeah, I've rejiggered a little bit. And welcome back to Streaming with Rachel. So, my background is in sort of the study, and this is really in my wheelhouse, computational interfaces and language variation. And if you ask somebody a question like this, what do you call a big road on which you drive relatively fast? Probably the answer that is going to be closest to sort of their natural way of speaking when they don't think they're being observed is going to be one thing, but if you present them with a list of options, they might pick something else, right? So there's sort of a best practice in dialectology elicitation is to ask very not leading questions, like questions where you don't tell people a way to say things. So if I was trying to figure out how somebody in Washington State says bagel, I might say something like, oh, what do you call the round pastry with a hole in the middle of it that's not sweet that you might have with cream cheese and lox, to get them to say bagel without saying the word bagel, because then they might say it like I say it, or they might use a different word that is more like the word that I use because they're trying to be accommodating to my language use. So I think a conversational assistant is a really good way to have this sort of quiz presented, because it's going to be potentially more accurate in terms of the information that you get. Also, I think that a conversational assistant might be a good way to, present this information and let people play with. I guess this is sort of a play project. A tool like this, because it's going to be more accessible to more people. And in general, at least in the United States, people who have gone to college and are professionals tend to be more mobile, and people who are more working class or have work in the trades tend to be less mobile and also tend to have stronger regional features. And this is just sort of something that's we found in the sociolinguistic literature, and also perhaps aligns with your experiences if you are from the US or have spent much time here. And also very old and very young people tend to have more of these regional features than people who are sort of in their, 20s to 50s, 60s, I would say, sorts to be like the little gap where people use more standardized features and fewer of their sort of home language features, if that makes sense. And I think very old and very young people might find, in some cases, a conversational interface to be more accessible to them than, having to go to the New York Times and this looks like some sort of JavaScript widget, so maybe if your browser doesn't support that, then you'd have to download some stuff and get it all working. So anyway, that's my thoughts about why this would be a really good project to build a conversational assistant around it. Hey says, why Rasa? Why not Google Dialogflow or IBM WhatsApp? That's a good question. The trivial answer is that I work for Rasa. In sort of a more technical sense, so Watson and Dialogflow are both closed source. So if you wanted to extend their libraries in some way, I don't actually know how you would do that. I guess file a bug request with the team that's building the tool. So Rasa is open source, and if there was something you wanted to change, you could just make a pull request, and it might be accepted. Another reason is that I believe both Watson and Dialogflow need to run on their respective clouds. So Dialogflow is Google and Watson is IBM. And I think similarly for Amazon and Azure, you're sort of tied into that ecosystem. So if you had something that you absolutely wanted to run on your machines, like if you had data that for some reason you couldn't put in the cloud for legal reasons, or you just didn't want to, those options might not be as suitable for you. So I think it'll really depend on your project, which is the best choice for you. David says, who cares as long as it's not Lewis? I am unfamiliar with Lewis. Perhaps one of you can tell me more about it. All right, so that's the general premise. And I have an untitled document here, which is my very, very rough design doc. So my project goal is I want to build a conversational I'm just gonna go back and fix this problem later. I want to build a conversational assistant that will let people answer a set of dialectology elicitation questions and then give them information about their most likely, about which region most closely aligns with their language use. So I can see this being actually a pretty large project overall. To start with, I think I am going to start with just the dialects of the United States. First round, just the dialects of American English, US English, because American would also include Canadian English, and Canada has pretty separate dialect regions from the United States. Later on, include other dialect regions. And also something that I think would be a really nice extension of the dialect quiz would be to add a voice component. So there are pronunciation questions in the dialect quiz. So I think one is, do you pronounce the words C-A-U-G-H-T and C-O-T the same or differently? And for me, those are different words. So this would be caught and this would be caught. Caught has an open O, like on my coffee cup, coffee. But for some people, those are the same words. And I think instead of asking people if they say them the same or not, because sometimes people don't have a really strong intuition about the sounds that they're producing, or especially people who haven't been trained in close annotation. It takes a while to develop the ear to actually hear that. So I think actually asking people just to say them, and then somehow getting a close transcription out of the speech API that we use, which I think is honestly going to be the biggest challenge, would be a much nicer and more natural way of getting that sort of information. Jerry says, do you stream on YouTube only or also only on Twitch? If so, what's the name of your channel? Great to watch again. This one is on the Rasa channel, and I will paste the link. So I'm also streaming to Twitch right now. Black Hole says hi. Black Hole is here. Hi. Supriya says, hey, I need to know how the Rasa bot handover to real human agent works. If you share an example / link to working project, it will help. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but you might ask in the forums if you haven't already. That's probably going to be the place where you'll get the quickest answer. Also, the chat screen is over here, if you're wondering why I'm looking over to this direction. Maha says, can we deploy RasaBot on Twilio or the WhatsApp API platform? I think I've seen projects on Twilio. I should say, this is my second week in Rasa. So if you ask me very deep questions, I might just be like, check the docs. And this is one of the things I would check the docs. I'm pretty sure I've seen Twilio projects. I think I've also seen WhatsApp projects. I'm going to say I think so, but double check. Amit says, Rasa's learning curve is steep, but it's worth it once you get the hang of it. Python knowledge is a must. Their channel interfaces, Facebook, Telegram, should be improved, and I had to override and extend. Oh, that's really good feedback. If you'd be willing, I'd really appreciate a comment, just sort of talking about what things you found sort of steep in the learning curve, because that might be something we could improve. Avinash says, can you suggest a way to build custom date and time entity recognition, mainly for Indian regional languages? And then Rajiv says, I think Near Duckling handles most date features. Yeah. And then Nikhil says about Lewis that I asked about earlier, helps us to identify intent in the sentence we send to the bot, and is based on that, it calls the respective function in .NET code, just like creating a ticket. Help me create the ticket will be same. And Digital Breed says the Rasa bot can be integrated through Twilio over WhatsApp. That is helpful. Thank you. Rajiv says not Near Duckling, but NER Duckling for name entity recognition. Helpful, thank you. All right. I got sidetracked. More coffee. So in the future, but I think it's not going to be in the MVP or minimum viable product, I also want to include voice interface with pronunciation questions. With more pronunciation questions. So that's what I want to do. And I think it's going to be pretty involved, but I'm excited. I think this will be a hopefully fun and interesting project for everybody to watch. So the background, I'm going to copy. I'm going to add some additional background. The New York Times dialect quiz. There we go. From 2013 was wildly popular and introduced many people to the field of sociolinguistics / dialectology. That's not how you spell dialectology. So sociolinguistics is the study of linguistics, or language as it is used in social context and as it relates to social identity and practice. I didn't want to say practice, but that's the word that the answer is. And then dialectology is specifically the study, not subject, the study of dialects. A conversational interface for... Actually, I'm going to put this under the new bullet point. Should this project have a conversational interface? I think yes. Not offering multiple choices, but instead having free responses will allow for a more ecologically valid... No, there's got to be a better way for this. For better elicitation practices. Yeah. I'm trying not to use too much jargon, but I'm really deep in this particular field of jargon. AKA asking questions in a better way. I think another thing that might make a conversational interface really helpful is it would be great if users could ask questions about specific elicitations. What other ways of saying that are there? Or I'm trying to think about the specific questions that people have asked me about dialect and dialect features, because people tend to be pretty interested in it. I think because everyone uses a language or has interacted with a language at some point. So we tend to, just like as people, be interested in learning more about it. Is that associated with a specific... No one's going to say this, specific region, something like that. I think more likely someone's going to say something like, do I say that weird? Which, no, if that's just what you say, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think a sort of like back and forth where you can ask questions about a specific question and then go back and continue the quiz. That sort of, interleaved conversational strategy, I think, will work pretty well as a conversational agent. And I know that Rasa can handle it. So I am looking forward to that. And other questions. Robbie says, don't try to learn everything at the same time. My head was about to blow, but now I can take a chill pill. That's really good advice. Little bite-sized pieces. And Robbie says, I like the sound of the keyboard. Thank you. Avinash says, Duckling supports only Hindi and doesn't support other languages. Oh, yeah. So I sort of know about Indian languages, and there are a lot of them. And there's also a couple distinct language families in the Indian subcontinent that are pretty distinct from each other. And there are also a lot of different writing systems. I'm just saying the things I know about Indian languages. But the point is that just knowing Hindi would be like trying to do African languages while only knowing Swahili. There's a lot of other languages. And I don't really know of any tools that have like a lot of support for like Marathi or Telugu or other languages that I could know off the top of my head. So if someone has suggestions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Snickle says, good to see you live. Oh, good to have you joining in live. Greg says, WhatsApp requires an approval process to use their API. Oh, that's good to know. Thank you, Greg. If many of you are not familiar with Greg, he's a customer support engineer at Rasa and customer success engineer? Customer success, correct me if I'm wrong, and has a lot more experience with the framework than I do. So a good question, a good person to direct questions to. All right. So I think this makes sense as a conversational interface because of the reasons that I've outlined previously. Oh, also more accessible, particularly to very old and very young users, which is not to say that very old and very young users can't use other types of interfaces, but particularly thinking about very young users. I mean, very small children generally aren't literate until they're around, I don't know, 6? That's when like reading starts. Maybe earlier than that? I don't remember how old I was when I started to read. 4-ish? Maybe I was 4 when I started to read. Started learning to read. It was a difficult process for me. But very young users might still have questions and may still want to learn about their regional, dialect features. And also, some people who are not very old or very young are also not literate. And voice interface in particular is much more accessible for people who are in that position for whatever reason. So I think this is a good reason to... another good reason to make this a conversational and particularly eventually a voice interface. All right. Joven says, do you have a guide how to build a nice conversation flow? Like what things to avoid? Oh, so I think my number one thing here is to use real conversations. So something about Rasa that's particularly unique and interesting is that it doesn't use sort of like the state machine tree dialogue design that many other platforms do. It instead uses sort of Let me see if I can get this right. I just got a very excellent introduction to the architecture. So when deciding what the next turn should be, there are 3 policies in place. So one is the memoization policy, not memorization policy. There's no R in it. And that, if it has been exposed to a conversation with exactly the same format before, it will use that same format because it has... the confidence of that policy will be very high because another human did it. And then there's the Keras-based policy, which will pick the intent via machine learning. I'm still digging into the internals. So if someone else has a better explanation. So that will sort of look across the number of responses, and the responses are all user specified. The responses aren't learned. If you wanted a new response, you'd have to add it by hand, which is how you avoid Tay type of situations. And if there's not like an exact conversation that's happened like this before, then it will pick the most likely conversation. I think there's the most likely next turn based on all of the previous turns in the conversation. And I think there's a third one. And I was so confident when I started talking that the third one was in my brain, but I think it's gone now. So if... a fallback policy. That's the one. So if there's nothing that's very likely, then you'll specify what the, like, I have no idea what's going on sort of response will be. So it might be like, is it one of these things? And then give people some options. Or it might be like, could you rephrase that last thing? So I think those are by default the 3 policies for picking the next turn, and they're not based on sort of a like strict path. So then your design process would be more sort of a data collection and curation process where you have real conversations and you use them to build your bot in the first place, but then to improve it as you get additional conversations and you annotate them and you sort of fold them back in. And that part of the process is what Rasa X is for, which is a free but not open source toolkit that and an interface that you put on top of your bot once you've initially deployed it, and then you can do sort of human in the loop updating, active learning, all those fun buzzwords to improve your assistant. I did remember the third one. The coffee's clearly working. So I think that is a really good question, Joven. Thank you. All right. What data will I need? So because of this flow, this dovetailed nicely. Joven was not a plant, but if they had been, this would have been a great question. So the data that I'm going to need is conversations, because it's sort of, this is more of a machine learning than a rule-based system. So rather than learning by rule, we're going to learn by example. And I'm also going to need a database of questions and some sort of policy for selecting questions. So the quiz itself has 25 questions and you just answer them all. I'm going to start again. It has 25 questions and you just answer them all, and then it gives you a map and it sort of guesses about where you're from. And I was lucky enough to find this blog post is what this is called. A little more sip of coffee. I was lucky enough to find this blog post that talks a little bit about the machine learning behind this, because I've been thinking about it, and there's a number of ways that you could do this. A little bit of coffee. So some ways, well, I'm just gonna start a new bullet point. Possible for those of you who have not had the pleasure of watching me try to type before, I am dyslexic. I was so sure I am dyslexic. So I'll have spell check on. So possible implementations. One would be ask the next most discriminative question until you arrive at a high confidence answer. So what I mean by this is you can imagine the map of the United States here as a decision region, and each question will have areas that it is more, each answer for each question will have areas that is more discriminative for, right? So based on the first question, we might say, okay, we don't need to ask other questions that are informative about this part of the United States, so things outside the South. We have a hypothesis that this person is from the South, which in my case would be correct. Also, I do say lawyer, but definitely a lot of older folks that I knew growing up said lawyer. Sorry, I'm trying not to get distracted by the questions. So we could then just ask more and more discriminative questions and sort of decrease the search space until we're like, hey, we're pretty sure you're from, near Durham or wherever. So that would be for location. And I believe the original dialect survey is based on zip code. So the pros of this approach, one big one is fewest questions / quickest quiz. And the big con is if an early question has an error or our maps are inaccurate, then additional questions will not be helpful. So if you say y'all because, I don't know, you like the way it sounds, and you, there we go. So if you say y'all because you like the way it sounds, but maybe you're from Wisconsin, if I continue to ask you questions trying to figure out from where in the South you're from, the answer is going to be that you're not from the South, so none of those questions are going to be super helpful. So you might end up in sort of like a bad part of the search space. There's a specific term for that, and I don't remember what it is. So that's one potential approach, which I think will be a little bit slower, more difficult to code. I think will be more difficult to code, and also there's this potentially sort of go down a bad path, which is sort of similar to something that you might run into if you're using a state machine for your dialogue choosing. Dialogue management? Dialogue flow? I forget the exact term. More coffee. It's pretty early for me. It's not that early, but it's still morning for me. All right, so another option would be to ask all the questions and then pick the area zip code with the highest probability. So I'm pretty sure pros, easy to do. Easy to do. Cons, as more questions are added, the length of the quiz will increase. For everyone. Other cons, longer. At least for me, I have a lower tolerance for number of turns with a conversational assistant than I do for questions in a forum. And I think for me, that's partially because it's much easier and quicker for me to answer a question in a forum than it is to have a dialogue turn with a conversational assistant, particularly if there are any sort of errors or on the voice side, if my voice isn't recognized correctly, that's really frustrating. Probably higher attrition. So in general, the longer a quiz thing is, the more likely people are not to finish it. With this, I mean, you could probably figure out, so I'm thinking about questions that are in the quiz. I've taken it a couple times. It came out while I was in grad school. It was manna from heaven for people who were teaching linguistics at the time. So I think everyone who was doing linguistics at that point has taken this quiz a few times, particularly if you were in the US. So if you were really lucky, you could get a very accurate answer for me in 2 questions. Actually, you could get a pretty accurate answer for me in 1 question. And the question is, what do you call a drive-through liquor store? I mean, a bad idea, ha ha ha. But specifically, the term that I have for it is a brew-through, which I think is spelled like that. And there's a bunch of them sort of in the coast of the Virginias and Carolinas, and they have like a little mascot that's like a guy with a cap, and everybody in my high school would like go down to like Virginia Beach for their holidays or the Outer Banks, and then come back and they had like the brew through t-shirts. Anyway, so that's probably the most discriminative question for me in particular. And if we had a very good amount of information, like if we picked our question well, and also it was a question that was very discriminative, it's possible that you could get in like 1 or 2 questions. Other options: hybrid approach. Hybrid approach. Ask a few questions to pick out major region and then drill down a bit. Pros, shorter. Cons, probably harder. Is this very small for you guys? Let me pop this up in a little bit, make it a little bit bigger. So some cons: harder to code, less probability of, that can't be right, of heading down a sad path. Another pro is will extend better to more dialect regions. So if we were going to stick with dialects of English, I could ask some questions about like, I could ask a couple questions designed to figure out if like, are you a Singapore English speaker? Are you a Nigerian English speaker? Are you a Scottish English speaker? Are you, a New Zealand or Australian English speaker? And, so I could start with a couple questions to sort of pick which of the quizzes would be most helpful, and then pick sort of like the sub-quiz. So that could be a really extensible way of doing it. I like this approach. Which I think is going to be a little bit harder, but I think might also be quite a bit nicer for users. Hi, Arnaki. Welcome back to you as well. So that's my thinking there. Another approach would be to use non-linguistic data like device location to start picking sub-quiz. And I bring this up because possibly more accurate, possibly shorter quiz duration. Cons: collects unneeded. Okay, I guess that's how that's spelled. And the cons is that it collects unneeded data on users. So I'm not gonna consider that. I know a big part of my dissertation was showing that if you do have non-linguistic data on people, you can be more accurate in speech recognition. But the more experienced I become, the less comfortable I am with collecting things like or even inferring things like demographic information or location when it's not absolutely necessary to the function of the program, and I don't need it here. Like it might have like a marginally better user experience, but I think the cost in terms of the data stewardship is going to be more than I am interested in handling. So I'm not going to do that. But it is, like, it's an approach you could take. I'm choosing not to do it. So those are sort of the main approaches that I have been thinking about. The way that I believe the original quiz does it is that it asks all the questions, and then it is based on the Harvard Dialect Survey, which has, let's see if I can find the information here. And let's zoom in so y'all can read this. See, I'm a y'aller. So it was based on the Harvard Dialect Survey, which Bert Vo was a lecturer at Harvard at the time, I believe, and every year when students came in, he asked them to fill out the quiz for themselves, and then also, I believe, family members, and also elicited data online. It's been a while since I looked into this. I think he's in the UK now. I don't think he's at Harvard anymore. And the original quiz resulted in about 50K observations, all of which are coded by zip code. So again, only people from the United States. And the questions themselves are, I believe, based on the Dictionary of American Regional English. Yeah, I think he is in Cambridge. The original questions and map can be found at dialect.redlog.net. Sorry. And dialect survey has been completed to see the maps about the survey. Since been revised. He's currently prepping an atlas of English dialects. Oh, interesting. I'm trying to find the original data set that this was based on, and I don't know the answer. My guess is probably the Dictionary of American Regional English, because that has been around for a very long time. I want to say they started data collection in like the 1800s, or maybe during the New Deal, but the DARE has been around for quite a while. Okay, and this is Bert Vo's current website. Ben Zimmer has an article, CC by NCSA3. Okay, so we can definitely use it as long as it's for non-commercial uses and we share alike, which I don't think is a problem because I want to open source this anyway, and I don't think it's commercial because I'm not getting money for it. I'll look into that and see if we can just use the survey. So we might be able to just use the information from the original survey. What does commercial purposes mean? I don't know. I'm doing it as part of my job, but it's for a project that's not really... This is a question for later. I'm getting sidetracked. I can feel myself getting sidetracked. So the way the original quiz worked is you asked all the questions, and then I believe it was K nearest neighbors. Let's see. Yeah, it's not an eager algorithm, which, so an eager algorithm would be the example that I laid out, where you ask the minimum number of questions to get a high accuracy answer. Okay, yeah, so that's all that it says in this blog post. DDS Wannabe says, lol, Freudian slip. Yeah, I think I was thinking about, social categories and differences and identity and, yep. And the South. If you're not familiar with the term redneck, it's, originally was used to refer to white sharecroppers in the American South. So it's sort of connected with rural identity and working class identity and Southern identity and Jeff Foxworthy has a number of comedy sketches on it if you're interested in learning more about this part of American culture. So the original algorithm just did k nearest neighbors, which I think is based on the original 50K sample, which is, what, they 25 questions? That's still going to be pretty fast. That's not going to be too slow. So we might do that. I might actually use gradient boosting instead, just because I like gradient boosting, and I don't know how fast k nearest neighbors is in pure Python. I think it's probably less fast than at inference time. I think it's probably less fast than a good gradient boosting algorithm, which are usually implemented in C. Let me just, implementation, KNN. Original implementation in KNN. Gradient boosting machines instead. Anyway, sorry, that's just me thinking about algorithms. We are so far from that. So that is an option there. And so note about here, see possible. Nope, so that's a policy for selecting question. These are possible implementations for picking dialect area. So these do both things. These both pick which question to ask next. So these will all have some sort of guidance about which question we should ask next, and also they all have some sort of way of selecting the final answer. So this would be sort of a tree-based method. This would be, originally it was KNN. I don't think we have to be wedded to that in implementation. This would use sort of initially a tree-based method and then a KNN. So the tree-based method would probably have some sort of order for the questions, and then it doesn't have to be a KNN. So we could have sort of an original set of discriminative questions, ask those, and then pick the subset of questions we want to ask based on those. And again, this one, which we're not using, where you would sort of, instead of asking questions to get to the first decision point, use other sorts of extra linguistic information. Okay, and so my point here is that the original quiz is CC by NCSA 3.0, which I know is different from 4.0 in some ways, but I don't. So we can use those questions. Okay, so for American English, I think we're set. I know that somebody did a similar quiz for English in the United Kingdom, and I believe that quiz was not put together by linguists. I think that one was done by journalists. I remember somebody talking about it on Twitter at some point. Possibly other quizzes. To come. But I think it would be better to start with just sort of the existing project and then port it into a conversational interface, and then from there make it more complex. So, start small and then add stuff, right? Okay, so I think that's a pretty good initial pass on what this might look like. So what I'm thinking about here is, so Rasa, I mentioned, doesn't really have a super strict first you ask question A, then you ask question B sort of structure, but I guess I could sort of do that using the memoization policy by having conversations that follow the exact sort of. So if I'm asking like 3 questions, I ask those 3 questions, and then I ask the rest of the questions. Sorry, I'm just thinking about how this would be best designed. I think in terms of making my life easier, at least for, I have a new possible solution. And again, I would like to really expand this beyond just, global north, to talk about a lot of other varieties of English. There's many English speakers, there's many English dialects, there's many speakers of world English, which is sort of English as a lingua franca. I think... Oop. Nope, I didn't want to print nothing. There we go. Pros. Easy to implement. Easy for users to understand. Very extensible. Cons. What's a con of doing it this way? I can't really think of anything less fun? Question mark? Maybe because you're not just being asked questions about language, you're being asked to sort of like pick your overarching dialect first, maybe? I think it's potentially more accurate because if people really want an accurate answer, they're probably going to say correctly what their top level dialect is. And if they don't want a correct answer, and they're just sort of like messing with it for fun, then they'll say the wrong one, and then they'll have a fun time taking the quiz and being like, haha, it was wrong. Which is like, I think, a perfectly reasonable way to use a fun quiz. I think I'm going to, given that we will do that first, and we could even ask it about different areas of the United States if we were interested in it. So we might say, do you consider yourself to be from the South? Do you consider yourself to be from, the West? Or something like that. That might be, well, the problem there shows an implementation. Other implementations considered. There we go. I warned you it was going to be all scoping today. So the problem with asking people about their regional identity within the United States to begin with is that that doesn't necessarily correspond well to dialect regions. So for example, most dialect regions are not one state big, with the exception of Florida. Florida's weird, because there tends to be a lot of immigration from across the United States into Florida, so it doesn't have a lot of sort of like discriminative traits of its own, except for the Panhandle. And Hawaii. And Alaska? I know there's a lot of First Nations languages in Alaska. I don't know much about Alaska. I know quite a bit more about Hawaii and dialects there. So I wouldn't necessarily want to start by asking people which dialect region they're in, because they may not have a good sense of dialect regions, or a sense of affinity to a particular dialect region. So there's this thing called the nowhere trough that sort of goes down the middle of the United States. So like people from, sort of covers like Missouri, part of Oklahoma, part of sort of like that middle bit where people will say, oh, I don't have an accent, or I'm not part of a dialect region, or people who are sort of trying to draw maps of where the different dialect regions are in the United States, or where do you think people speak differently, just won't put anything there. Anyway, so this is, I'm thinking through why I would ask very high-level questions here. Very broad dialect area, and not more low-level questions. That means that we could have more targeted questions right away. Below country, level users may not have a strong sense of affiliation with a specific dialect region. If you're interested in learning more about how people think of dialect regions, the study is called Perceptual Dialectology. Ooh, I'm dusting off everything from my degree today. No, not everything. Perceptual dialectology is the study of how do people think about dialect regions, and it doesn't always map up super well to be nice, is that we can use the quiz responses, which I think have also been open source maybe. So let's go down and give myself to do. So I will do these probably offline and then come back next week and tell y'all what I did. See if I can find the responses to the dialect quiz. So the reason that I want to see this is because if you go through the quiz and you have sort of something like, how do you pronounce the first syllable of lawyer, rhymes with boy, rhymes with flaw, and people pick one of those, then we could take the question and the answer and use that as just a dialogue turn, and then take that pairs of questions and answers from a specific user, turn those into a conversation, and then use that conversation as training data for our bot. So I think that would probably be the easiest way. Oh, sorry. Kate, maybe, says, I'm enjoying this live. Are you going to code too? Probably starting next week. I want to make sure that I have a good plan starting going in. And I've also had some just like conversations with people where they suggested it was very helpful for them to see sort of the design process. So this is me starting the design process. Yeah. And David says, are you trying to decide where they're from or how they speak now? So the question is more what areas, starting with US, are most closely associated with the particular dialect features that person has. So I guess from, if that's what's most strongly affecting their language usage, or if you have somebody who's moved to an area and then has had like really strong accommodation to that dialect, then it would probably say like, hey, you're from this area because you use all these features of this area. So I'm definitely not trying to pinpoint people's physical location. Let me point that out right now. I think it's just sort of a fun way to be like, hey, here are some features that you have. Yeah. David said, asking which country is very direct. Asking a vocabulary question will tell you the same thing. Maybe is the thing, because it might... excuse me. People might not have all the features associated with a specific area. Yeah, no, it is very direct. Like I said, it's less fun is definitely a main drawback of that. Hello, encoding. Rajiv says, in my opinion, asking about US or UK English may almost influence a user bias towards that dialect. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. But it's pretty... So the regional differences between UK English and US English are very, very different. So I wouldn't ask the same questions of somebody in the UK as I would in the US. So I'm trying to come up with a good example of something that's like very discriminative in the United States and is not in the UK. So you could ask somebody, do you have the same vowel in grass as another? So I don't have the trap-bath split. For me, the vowel in trap and bath are the same vowel, and that's true for most people in the United States. But in England, that's a very strong divide that has a strong regional identity, and I don't know. I don't know where the region is, because UK dialects are not my forte. But that's something that you might ask somebody from the UK, but not necessarily. What if I was in focus? There we go. But not necessarily somebody from the US. So that's why I think it would make sense to give people different quizzes based on which quiz they wanted to take. Yeah, it might be helpful to phrase the question like, would you prefer to take the US or the UK version? But yeah, very, very good things to think about when designing what this interaction will be like. So things that I have to do. And this is a very informal possible implementations. This is a very high level planning, but I want to have like a good plan going into it, because if I started out being like, hey, I'm going to do this sort of like tree-based structure where I just ask more and more discriminative questions, then later on I was like, oh, that's not actually going to work. If I instead have thought about my approach quite a bit, and have thought about how that's going to affect the ways that I create my project, then I think it will end up saving time. That's the hope. All right, so see if I can find the responses to the dialect quiz and recast those as conversations. And I also, I remember that the original dialect quiz, which was done by Josh Katz, I remember that his very first implementation was actually in R. It was a Shiny app. So I want to see if I can find the Shiny app, the original Shiny app that I was literally just looking at this, Josh Katz did, to see how that works, because that might be a good place to start. And also, you can, so the way I'm probably going to do this is I'm probably going to have some custom actions. Those of you who haven't used Rasa a bunch, you may not be familiar with this, and I am very generally familiar. I've used it like twice at this point. But the idea is one of the potential things that your bot can do, or your assistant can do, is it can go and run some arbitrary code that's running on a different server, and the code can be in any language. So if there's our code that already like has the business logic in it, then I can just use that and then pass the answer back and do it that way, which might be a little bit easier for me, or at least I can sort of see the general implementation details. So try to find Josh Katz's, there we go, original R implementation and use and look at it. It may or may not be something I want to use for this. Shiny is a visual UI, not a conversational UI interface. You don't need to say interface. Shiny is a visual UI, not a conversational UI, so I don't know how transferable anything is going to be, but it might be a starting place. And it's always, I don't know, I find it helpful to see how other people have implemented the same thing. Okay, so it is a little past 10 now. I've got lots of things to do in the meantime. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to start planning or like start the bot. I'm going to start planning, but I'm not going to actually like start coding on the bot until we're together again. And also I want to use Bot Society. I haven't used it before, but I know you can do your design here and then export it to Rasa, and you'll have, you will now get a zip file containing all the files you need for the Rasa stack to work, which sounds like a good start to me, and like it will make my life much easier. So I might play around with that, and then when we are together again, I'll probably go through the design to process again through here. But again, first I wanted to make sure that I knew what I wanted before I started thinking about, you know, more concrete implementation details. All right, so I've got stuff to do. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on YouTube. I'll keep my eyes peeled on them. Eyes peeled on them, what's that? I will keep an eye on them and take them to heart. And we will be back for sure next Friday, do a bot society design, and then do some coding, get going, and maybe even have a very rough prototype by next Friday that we can start expanding on. I don't want to promise that, but I feel in my heart like it's doable. So, all right, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful or interesting, or that you enjoyed it in some capacity, and I will be back next Friday. And next Friday, hopefully we'll be doing some like actual coding and not just a bunch of talking and thinking, which is still part of the engineering process. And that's just the way it is. So we probably won't do this right away, but I'm pretty happy with this as an implementation. And, you know, 25 questions is not that many. How long does a turn take usually? I don't know how long a turn takes. I do eventually want this to be assistance. I do eventually want this to be a, what's the word I'm looking for? Voice assistant, and how long most users will stick around for. Rajib says, what's the name of the tool? Bot Society. Can I zoom in? Will it be bigger? Yeah. So it's, the website is app.botsociety.io. So, all right. Thank you for joining me. I've got some stuff to do. Yeah. I don't know where I'm going to find this out, but I'll hunt it down. And I'll let you know what I found out next Friday. Thank you for joining me, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you later.